introduce you for sure.
Yeah. Coming in. This is great. Just in time. Come on in.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Thanks for coming to Zibby's. We appreciate you guys taking time out of your busy Thursday night to make your way down for a very fascinating author talk. We are very excited to have Emily Hyland here tonight talking about her new collection of poems, Divorced Business Partners. Congratulations.
Yes. Thank you.
Personally, this is very exciting for me, considering my diet consists of pizza about like 4 or 5 times a week, including Emmy Squared, which is one of her businesses, just 2 nights ago. So thank you very much for providing my dinner. So I'll do a quick bio, but typically we do about a 30-minute conversation between the two of them. We'll open it up to a Q&A and then plenty of books to buy and sign as well. So tonight we have Emily Hyland's debut collection, Divorced Business Partners, is forthcoming with Howling Bird Press in October 2024. It is not forthcoming, it's here. It's very exciting. Her second collection, Post-Mastectomy Poems, is forthcoming with Cornerstone Press, an imprint of the University of Wisconsin Press in September of 2026. So more poems to look forward to. Hyland's poetry has appeared in the Brooklyn Review, Frontier Poetry, the Holland's Critic, among others. She earned her MFA in poetry and her MA in English education from Brooklyn College. Her cookbook, Emily the Cookbook, was published by Ballantine Books, an imprint of Random House in 2018. Hyland is the eponymous co-founder of the international restaurant groups Pizza Loves Emily and Emmy Squared Pizza. She lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where she writes and teaches at Yoga Source, a beloved local studio that she co-owns and directs. So thank you very much for being here.
Yeah.
And we also are very excited to have Kristin Matthews, who is an Emmy Award-winning television producer and executive. She was most recently the showrunner on CBS's The Talk. She has directed production and created content on authors, poets, and publishing industry. So thank you very much as well.
Thank you.
And take it away.
Great. Well, absolutely my pleasure. I'm sure you guys know that they're selling this book. I would encourage everyone to buy it. I have, as you can see, marked many things in it. It's a really wonderful collection. It's really heartfelt and I think so true. You are so honest throughout it. I wanted to read one quote that was here, though, because Divorced Business Partners, a love story, is a story about the ending of your relationship, your marriage ending, and what that felt like. But he has a great quote where Jose Alvarez, who says, "It is too diminishing to call these poems divorce poems. They are life poems. They live and breathe and delight even through the hurt." And I think that really sums it up so perfectly. I know you're going to read some poems for us, but before we do that, I just wanted to start off just with a little scene setter of why, in telling your story, did you choose poetry? Why was that the thing you chose to express all of this?
Yeah, poetry has always been the place I've gone. I started writing poetry in 7th grade in Mrs. Berrien's English class, who I actually got to see on this little tour and connect with her. But we did a chapbook unit during National Poetry Month, and it was the first time I ever felt the safe space to emote and share vulnerability and then be able to express that and stand in front of the class and read this poem. My best friend broke up with me and basically divorced business partners 30 years ago. Yeah, it just seemed the pith of it and being really concise and the layers of lyricism that you can weave into the storytelling I've always gravitated towards that genre more than anything else.
Were any of these poems things that you wrote separately, or were you always thinking about this as a start to finish collection?
Separately. There's maybe 2 or 3 in here that I wrote in grad school back in, call it 2005, when I was still with this person before we got married and was in a presumably happy time in my life. So it was really interesting to add to this when I was building the collection to see some interesting foreshadowing there.
Mm-hmm.
But my process writing is really a spiritual practice of healing for me. It's a morning ritual. So most mornings I'm doing just generative writing that then I sculpt and craft thereafter. So a lot of these were written just kind of not with the idea of writing a book, but just processing what I was going through. And then some retrospect poems as I was looking back and then starting to craft the book as a whole.
With that in mind, I know you chose kind of a thematic selection of poems for us tonight. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're going to read and then jump on into that?
Yes. So in light of the political climate this week, I am writing the most female empowered poems in here about my right to have had an abortion, which saved my life. emotionally and got me out of a really toxic situation. So I'm really proud to be able to sit here with a group of, I see lots of head shaking, so like-minded people, and yeah, express that as a means of advocacy and empowerment for other women in this country.
Great. Do you want to take it away?
Yeah. All right. Thank you all so much for being here too. I know this is a really hard week for all of us, and I was really nervous that like no one would show up tonight, and so I'm just very grateful to see all these faces here. Okay. One night early on, as we're about to leave, Brad pops into the bathroom to pee before we go. He comes out with a torn look on his face. "Are you okay? What's going on?" I ask. He says there's a baby mouse in there in the corner. He knows by speaking it alive, he's assigned its death. So tiny, nobody would have seen the pink creature curled into the place where floor meets wall at the foot of the garbage. When he escorts me in to see, we stand, as parents will never be together, admiring the unopened eyes of the newborn as if she predates her own creation by 3 years, as a warning in the shape of this little mouse. If she foreshadowed her own life, neither of us noticed the omen. The mouse is a pink eraser. She was a pomegranate seed before I washed her away. She announced herself the month after he left. Why would I grow what had already gone? We contemplate options in the dim lit room. What's the choice? Brad swaddles the mouse in a kitchen towel. He cups the poor thing in his palms. If he lets it go free, it won't survive the cold. He carries mouse gently out to the street. This will be the only time it breathes fresh air. A moment of life under stars and wind against its pruny, unfurred skin. He folds the towel over mouse well and puts the bundle down. Pauses. The air is winter clear. He breathes a long breath in, looks up at the inky sky, then stamps his heel down hard. Yeah, nothing like levity this evening. Okay, so this is called After Drafting the Divorce Agreement. I don't know how to write about the way his eyes looked that last time, the sparsely flowered bedding. It isn't fucking, it's not making love. It's a power line cut, a body alone in my body, his bile eyes above me, bothered dreamboats of anger. Those eyes, the pitch of raven, starless punctures, ink-like vein popping across unsunny under eye, heavy as if hit. When it's time to sign, he makes inane edits anew, again asks me to dinner. I want the story to be, no woman will ever uncover him more, will know how his dad would read to him at the beach, how he savored the rustle of his father's feet against summer sheets to lull him to sleep. And other bits too, how he doesn't like his ribs to be touched or the bony part of his iliac crest. How to hold him is a skill of sliding an arm around his skein of bones, barely to brush and be very still. The last time was the only time he entered when he no longer lived at home. I stood before the mirror after in the bathroom full of shadows. I never thought I'd know something so holy, but I'm not kidding. Right there at the sink, the altar, I saw my reflection and knew what rooted in the strange fertile ground of my body. Grieving, I couldn't nurture the despair, so let go as do trees of their ambering leaves. Cellular parting. Some clinic mom finds in Midtown, waiting room, coupled teens in chairs. They call me in, a nurse sticks a thing inside me to confirm. When it's time, I don't realize. Twilight, barefoot, stepping on ants in summertime, red body against red body of patio brick, mushing into knot. Wake up in recovery, choose some crackers. I need to pee. They give me apple juice and Advil, tell me that's a common sensation. Daisy. She would have been 5 by now. First haircut strands, scotch taped against a page, would have yellowed in the drawer. I won't forget the scraping claw of end of marriage denouement, the rigor of his coming in a bed not ours. Harder than harpoon, his stare pushed in. When he tore into the core of me, we made a decision. In he went, and I let him. There's no way two bodies tangle with such a lock and not conceive. I'd never had that sex before, nor have I since. Eyes black holes of licorice. He didn't really want to leave. Put himself in me, and in she swirled to the melee. Socket flared, then out with the melee, down the black hole of my pelvic flume, torn out into no place we know. And then I'm actually going to pivot, and I'm going to read you. Is it okay with you guys if I read two more? Sure. Okay. So this is from a new collection, which is taking the story of this thread that I've shared with you and exploring the layers of grief and the unraveling. Hi, thanks for coming. Into a whole new level of awareness. So this is tracing my sister's pregnancy as a means for finding my way into this person who would have been Daisy. So I'm going to read you two of them. This week, Poppy is a blueberry. She's on her way to bean-sized, heartbeat on the ultrasound. Dune sends me a picture of her circled in purple. 7 years ago, Dune biked over from Bushwick with ice cream from a bodega, pit stop in her front basket, and a pregnancy test in her backpack. A good sister covers all bases. And when I was done peeing and the line showed us, and even though Brad was already living at his brother's place, and my poppy seed seemed to have been set in motion during our last fuck after the blur of a trattoria dinner in the flower district, when we both didn't understand what was happening as it was happening, and we were unnodding even though we were used to being nodded. So our bodies needed the tangle in uncertainty and after wine. And even though I knew and Dune knew, I wouldn't allow who had come to be to take her right in earth form, Dune and I still held each other's upper arms and jumped up and down with joy at the news. It's not that I didn't want her. I couldn't have coped with co-parenting during divorce, sharing the newborn, holding her absence so early in her life. She was already gone. Those nights I imagined Brad bottle feeding her a neighborhood away. And then this is the last one I'll read you. I'm in a weekly workshop with Mark Doty, who's an amazing poet and been an extreme gift in my, he's wonderful, an extreme gift in my life. And this is his favorite of this series that I've been working on. And this is from, it's been a wild process writing these. This is from the perspective of who would have been Daisy out there somewhere in the universe. The wound is when I awoke. I'm beyond form without eyes that make meaning with a page, space between inhale and exhale, that still place where air meets pond lip before wind, before water, strider, skitter, surface into distraction, quiver of aspens and after, knitted into matrix, into something beyond a corporal mother. Everything these words offer and awareness underneath. I don't suffer the world as you do, or maybe that's not fully true. If she envisaged me as more than a cell clump, and if I was conjured when her tissue multiplied as matter on its way to who would have been me, then I tasted a moment of missing entry into a very specific state. But I don't miss what I never knew. Before you were here, you didn't know to miss it. You were as I am, absence unsignified, unattached, infusion with greater fabric. You came through a portal I didn't, and you'll go through it again on the other side of all you've come to think necessary. But how much of what you have do you really need? What makes you cling and desire? What makes you want and cleave? What makes you afraid to shed form for formlessness? I'm energy. I'm here, even though I'm not. Don't you feel me? True as any other voice, even though I never existed enough to distinguish and parse into memory. Won't you remember me? Won't you register me when the first gust of fall air raises goosebumps on your arm, or when wood splits as your fire revs down a seam, releasing steam, and you hear a pop? Thank you,
Wow.
everybody.
Thank you, and thank you for sharing the new material. I'm curious, in the process of time and what has changed in the world from when you went through the experience to writing the poems in the book, putting them out into the world, and now with this new collection that you have, where are you emotionally on it for yourself, for the country, for women in general, and where do you see your voice in that conversation?
I feel a deep sense of urgency to get this new collection out. While I've been away these past few weeks, I just did a really big revision, and I'm going to head back to do a revision with my mentor, Janine, your mentor too, and start sending it out, because I think what is really important to me in the way I talk about the abortion in both versions is that this isn't something that people take lightly, and people mourn and grieve and still need to have the right to that option. So I feel very charged and empowered to use my art as a means to support that level of consciousness for everybody.
Well, and it's interesting because writing of any kind, poetry included, is such an interior process. It's such a thoughtful process that goes on. And now you're putting this out into the world, but you also clearly have a mission behind it for yourself in terms of how you're sharing it. How is it being received by people in terms of the book, which is out there now?
It's being received fine, like really well. I was telling somebody earlier in here that I was at an event at Poets House in New York City with a real, probably the largest crowd of folks I was interacting with on this tour. And I read this stream because I was there in conversation with Mark, and it became, and I don't think I had really expected, right? Like that I was going to be in conversation with this group of like 70 people about my abortion, right? So there was a realization that I'm putting myself in this vulnerable space, but people are reinforcing like that's what can we do? We can do advocacy work through the very simple ways we already live our lives. And so this is a way I live my life, and I'm not afraid. I mean, what are they going to do? Throw me in jail for something that happened 7 years ago while it was still legal? Great. My husband's a lawyer. We'll fight.
You'll be okay. Exactly. Exactly. We talked about the urgency of this next collection. How much faster have you been churning that out versus working on this book?
I'm a pretty generative writer.
Okay.
I am at minimum drafting a poem a week, usually in a space of real fire and excitement, maybe 2 to 3 poems a week. I twice a year do a 30 poems in 30-day challenge, and so bust through and get a lot of raw content done, and then just tinker and refine and revise. So I've been working on the new, this took a little bit longer, right? First book, figuring things out.
Right.
I've been working on the new one since my sister got pregnant in June. We're in month 6-ish, and I'm going to keep writing until she has the baby. And that's sort of the frame for the project.
Got it.
Yeah. My new book coming out, post-mastectomy poems.
Right.
It was
I was just gonna ask
from
about that.
from after the surgery to like the 1 year mark was like a chunk that I just like, I do these chunks around seminal times in my life.
Interesting. You kind of give it a beginning and an end in your head in terms of what you're looking to accomplish during that.
Like very project based.
Interesting.
Yep.
And how does it work with you I know you're in workshops, you do have mentors, but in terms of sharing it, are there people in your life who are the ones you go to say, look at this, or do you present it all kind of as a whole and say, this is what I've created?
Yeah. So when I write a poem, my husband usually will be a sounding board, and I'll read it to him, because it's important with poetry to read out loud. And, if nothing else, not for him to internalize it, but for him to be a mirror for me to receive it back in. When I'm in, Jay here and I are in a weekly generative group together. And so we'll write and then share out very rough work at the end of that with a small group. I bring a poem a week to my workshop. in this book, I was sharing more polished and curated poems with my ex-husband, who I was writing it about.
Curious about that.
Yeah, so it varies, but it's very poetry world oriented. Yeah.
Who are in this moment, you and I were talking a little bit beforehand about, there's been so much as we're all processing what did and did not happen on Tuesday into Wednesday. And for so many of us, the pain of that, the disappointment. Social media has been a very interesting place for anger and hurt, but also a place where people are sharing. I think 1 out of every 2 people in my life has posted the Langston Hughes poem Tired, which is so powerful. There's a great quote by Toni Morrison about the importance of art and artists being out there right now. Where do you turn in these moments? In the writing, obviously, is one outlet, but who are the voices in your life, artists and otherwise, who are providing you with some hope and maybe even some joy or sense of possibility?
I really love that. So I have been very slowly, and I'm glad it's been slow that I haven't finished it, making my way through Ross Gay's Book of Delights, which
Fantastic.
I highly recommend if you need some joy. He did a year-long project from a birthday to his next birthday, where every single day he wrote a little vignette about the joys he experienced in the tiniest little things, like the way the fly landed on the handle of his mug and the way the light was catching in the fly's wings, and then how perfectly his fingers sit in the handle of the mug. And it's so beautiful, and his work really turns towards joy and hope, regardless of anything. And that I had that book with me. And so I've just really been living in that. And then I've also been slowly enjoying Frances Weller's The Wild Edge of Sorrow, which is a grief book.
Okay.
But it's about not leaning into the misery of grief, but there's a quote in there: grief dares us to love once more. And that's very much the thesis of the book, that how can we, in these places where we feel like we're in the abyss, grow and rise and move through into a new space of resilience. So those are 2 companions that have been helpful.
And it's interesting, when I was reading up on you and looking at your website, you also have these other areas of your life that are not poetry related, you have a thriving yoga practice in Santa Fe, you have the pizza restaurants. How does all of this intersect for you in the Venn diagram of Emily? How does this all come together? Is it just things that you love?
I came through the restaurant portal. It was a decade of my life that got me where I am. And I co-own and direct a small neighborhood yoga studio in Santa Fe. And that is another source of deep nourishment for me as a human. And I'm headed home tomorrow and very eager to just be in the community and do some space holding with folks to just do somatic movement and process what we're feeling. And so that's a woman-owned studio, and a lot of elders in that community too. So it feels really very grounded.
When you think about this book being in the world now and then what's to come, are you someone who hopes that it creates an emotional resonance? Are you hoping that it creates a call to action? Do you have that preconceived, or is it just you put it out there and it's kind of for each person to take in as they do?
It was less about the audience. I've done a lot, but really my only ambition ever has been to publish a collection of poetry. So when the cookbook came out with Random House, that's like a big deal, but
Yes.
it didn't feel like it counted. It's like it missed the mark,
Still working on the poems.
I'm not a cookbook writer. I'm a poet. So it was really for me more than anything. And then thinking through, what am I doing with this product now that is in the world? It seems to be, though I didn't touch on these particular poems tonight, we looked at a very specific thread. Predominantly women at my readings have been coming up to me who are in the middle of a divorce. People who are going through a harrowing separation are really feeling very touched by this. And I felt very alone and very ashamed when I was going through that experience. And so this being a companion for people moving through those waters feels really resonant for me as well.
Do you think that for some people, poetry is not always the preconceived notion might be that it's not the most accessible? I mean, reading this, it's the most accessible, the most raw. I mean, it's so beautifully done, but I think some people have almost like a mental block about poetry. They're still thinking about their 7th grade classroom and having to memorize some obscure
Scan the
person.
lines.
Exactly. Iambic pentameter, etc. What do you think? I mean, I do feel like there's an interesting moment happening with so many poets out there, I think, talking about real life in a way that is different. Do you feel there's a shift, or there's just a greater knowledge?
I think that there's a range, right? There's associative and lyric and abstract poetry, which is also very hard and intimidating for me. I like to have guideposts so that I'm not wondering or feeling embarrassed that I don't know what's going on. I like to have a clear sense of what I'm reading so that I can get into the nuance and the subtext. And so for me, the narrative storytelling through lines and metaphor and imagery, I mean, I could pull the lines out and this would read like a little mini novella, right?
Right.
But there's more texture to the poetry. My poetry, I like it to be very narratively available. Yeah, and I think there is a lot of that. You know, Marie Howe,
Yes.
Sharon Olds, Sam Sachs, Ocean Vuong. I mean, I was talking at another reading, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. Did you read that?
Stunning.
It's like one long book of poetry, right? Like
Exactly.
it reads like a poem, but it's a novel. So
Yeah, because I think so many of us thought there was such a specific way that it had to be done. And all of you that you just mentioned are showing that there isn't one a prescribed way that you have to do poetry. There's so many other ways to come at it.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Tell us, I know you touched on it, but the book of poetry that's coming out next fall about your health experience and all that, can you give us a little bit more about what's in that? And how does it feel now in the mix of these two other projects that are going on?
Yeah, I have some space. I have my second book called Post-Mastectomy Poems coming out in 2026. I had a prophylactic double mastectomy with reconstruction about 1.5 years ago. And best decision I ever made. I'm a walking PSA, get your breasts checked, female humans. And so that is very bodily oriented. There's waves of like next generation divorce business partner poems in there. That book is a lot of absence and signifiers. What was here felt toxic. And now that it's not here, what is that absence? What is that longing? And so that also very interestingly translated with more distance from the marriage into poems that also are dealing with absence and signifiers and loss of something that was close to me. So there's an intersecting of those, but like a lot of pretty gross bodily poems about what that procedure is like and what it's like to recover from that. And I know so many women more and more as I get older and as I'm broadening into those communities and support groups who are going through that kind of thing. And companionship is so important. So I want that to feel like a companion too. So it's like, oh yeah, you have a fake belly button now. Like you have to remember that it's there and like clean it, you know, like things like that.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
I want to open it up. We have a little time for some audience questions if people have things. Yes.
Hi.
I went through a crazy divorce. This is my daughter.
Hi.
I became a divorce coach as a result and helped people going through really high conflict divorces. But I was just curious, as you were writing, people told me to journal and I just couldn't do it. There was so much trauma, so much. I was just trying to survive and thrive. How did you self-care when you were going through your journey and also as you were writing these books?
That's a great question. So being in the yoga community, it was just like drag myself and cry on the yoga mat in a child's pose if I can't do anything else, right? Like that was number one. And then I got myself to a grief retreat called Writing Your Story of Loss and Transformation at Ghost Ranch in New Mexico, which is where Georgia O'Keeffe lived and worked. And you're like literally in her landscape. I was just telling you about this. And it was with this amazing teacher named Mirabai Starr, who's in the lineage of Natalie Goldberg. I don't know if anyone knows Writing Down the Bones, a great book. And it's all about generative writing to just get it out. And so the grief retreat was like writing through your grief, write it, get it out of your body. And that was really the impetus for like the seeds for this book. The mantra of Mirabai is everyone has a right to tell their story. And it was really powerful to be in a room of like 25 people all day long for a week who are dealing with all sorts of losses, like having lost a child, having lost a partner, having a long-term partner in a dementia memory care facility, a broken marriage, like to witness all of that and hold space for each other really was the biggest self-care I could have done. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Other questions? Yes.
When you're writing and you're being so raw and vulnerable, like since the book has been published, is there any parts of it that you feel like I don't know if I should have written that, or I can't believe I shared that? Anything that you regret putting in or that you were scared to come out?
That's a good question. So my ex-husband has seen, as far as I know, most of this book, what I've showed him. I don't know if there's a like really intense fight on the street and a jail scene and things like that that were very hard in real life. And I don't know, I was nervous about what his reaction might be to that being out in the world. I was nervous about the abortion poems, but at this point, I don't give a fuck, like, excuse my language, but I'm using them for what they deserve to be used for. It hit me that a few weeks ago, it's like, oh, I'm going to be sitting in front of rooms of people talking about this part of my life. But there's nothing, going back to answering your question, what is there to be afraid of? Like, we're all carrying so many layers of grief and pain and history and life. And it's a really healthy reminder that other people are walking alongside, like we're all just walking each other home, and that it's okay to share. So I don't regret anything in here. I stand by what it all is, and it was a huge pivotal moment of life change for me, and I'm grateful for the experience, and so I want to share it. Yeah, and hopefully it will give other people the courage to share. Like Erin knows that I do a lot of, I lead a lot of retreats, and on those retreats, I do somatic writing practice. So we move in our bodies, we get stuff out, and then we clear it out, like literally clear it out of our bodies through our pens. And I feel like this kind of writing and sharing models what I'm asking my students to do. So, yeah.
You had a question, right?
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing these poems. It was beautiful.
Thank you.
Tearing up a little bit, just really moving. I just have a question about your writing process. I know you mentioned it's really generative, and then you kind of shape it. I was wondering when you know a poem is finished, because like, unlike narrative writing, there's not necessarily like an ending, right? So how do you know when a poem is done and you're done editing it, revising it? It's what you need it to be.
That's another really good question. If I were to do another pass through this, I would make changes. I don't think, not in a way that indicates that this isn't polished, right? This has gone through probably 30 rounds of fine tooth revision at this point. But it's a life process, right? I like in a yoga practice, I'm not ever perfecting a warrior two. Right. My entire life, I'm feeling into the sensation of what it's like to really straighten and brighten my arms and firm my thigh to my thigh bone and develop a deepening intimacy with that posture. And I feel like it's the same thing with the poems, is that it's a deepening intimacy with those poems. And maybe these, these are in their book, they'll go on the shelf and they won't necessarily go through drastic revision, right? But poems that have been sitting a while come back into the conversation. And then with 2 years of studying and reading and being in conversations with people, there's a whole new awareness to refining. And for me, it's like pruning, which Jay and our teacher Janine talks about a lot. Like, we're trying to find this chord, this essence, and when we can really clear away those dead leaves, the beauty of the essence is shining through more brightly. So I just think it's like life, like they'll be done when I'm dead. Yeah.
Can I continue on that?
Sure.
That note, I'm really interested in your process from your generative, which sounds very similar to journaling in some ways too. I'm not sure if it is, but generative writing and getting on the paper, later on going back and editing and rewriting, and how you work at that point with your mentors or other people, or how that might intersect in your yoga practice, or people who in your studio. Read this now. I'm just trying to interested in continuing the process that you're talking about.
It intersects with my yoga in terms of how I'm choosing to live my life. A huge part of practicing yoga, right? The asana practice on the mat is 1/8 of what yoga is, right? It's a whole way of being. And a huge part of that way of being is relinquishing ego hold and attachment, right? And the more I'm able to strip my ego and my want from the poems, the clearer they become. So it's been a lot of that practice when I'm moving through yoga, and then applying that sense of awareness to the writing. And then I see my mentor, Janine, twice a week for 90 minutes, one-on-one, and I'll bring a piece and we will spend probably 45 minutes per poem. So maybe like 1 or 2 poems and really refine and tinker. And she does a really good job of asking me to let go of things. And that was really hard when we first started to work together. This woman wants me to take those 2 stanzas and just delete them? What the hell? No, those are my words. They're good. And so over time, I feel like the biggest growth that's happened is the shedding, right? The cleaning the clutter out. So I'm constantly looking to find the sculpture in the marble. I really try not to be defensive, not to put my claws in. And every time I make a change like that, it's always for the better. Like I really can't think of a time where I've gone back and been like, I actually really want that line back in. You know, I have that document where I like dump all those lines because God forbid I actually delete them, but I haven't looked at them in a really long time. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
It seems like you navigate a lot of different spaces, creative spaces and spaces for your own. I was wondering, are you a different version of yourself depending on if you're in the food space, yoga space, or writing space? And then how do those all connect? How do you bring all those different talents that you have together? And just how does that happen? Because you're successful in so many different. How is it that you're able to navigate that?
Thank you. The yoga and the poetry, they feel the same to me in terms of they're different physical and thinking practices, but they are very aligned to me. And I always start class through the lens of a poem and then thread that through in my teaching, not one of my poems, but a poem that I'm reading or whatever, thread that through in relationship to the practice. So I'm constantly looking at ways that those 2 worlds are intersecting. Restaurant world, which I'm not a part of so actively anymore, is like a whole other different space. And that was a space where I was not who I feel like I am in the process of continually becoming who I am, like we all are, right? I am more who I am now than I was in that space. And in that space, I had an activated nervous system and I wasn't breathing and I wasn't tapping into being present and awake to all of those delights like Ross Gay is seeing every day. I was very closed off and shut down and in just like operating mode. And so I'm fortunate and glad that served me. It got me here, but that I'm not in the daily space of that because that's a really hard world to be in. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
And I'm sorry for the cursing with her.
She doesn't recognize those words.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes.
On the process front, are there poems that didn't make the book, and why didn't they?
Thank you. Another good question. So I got to meet Sharon Olds, who's like
The best.
yeah, she's amazing. If you need any recommendations on her, if you've never heard of her and you want a book of poetry, I'll recommend to you. I'm sure there's 1 or 2 here. But I met her at a writing retreat a few years ago at Community of Writers. And I had you get like a little 7-minute one-on-one with a teacher of your choice. And I sat down with her and she was talking to me about how for every book that she writes, she has maybe 70 to 100 poems that don't make it in, right? You're writing around the subject matter. You're writing the same poem 20 different times to try to find the way in. And that was really helpful for me, right? Because again, through that ego thing, it's like, oh, I wrote something, it's done, great. Like, let's add that in. It's like, no, okay. I just did this revision of the new book last week, and I cleared maybe 5 or 7 poems that were just kind of like, some of them were clearing the cobwebs, some of them were building on an idea that I need to come back to. So I clear a bunch of poems every time I write something. Maybe it's stanzas, maybe it's whole poems, maybe it's a whole idea and orient to another. So there's no expectation that it's like, oh, I'll hit my 48 to 60 poems and then I'm done. It's probably more like I have 100 poems and now I'm gonna start to narrow in on what that path is. Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
I have a question about your writing process. when you're writing, do you consider how your work will be received by the larger audience who's reading it? Or is it more about just writing your experiences and putting it out there, and however it's received, it is what it is? Or when you're writing, are you actually considering what the audience is going to respond to, what kind of verbiage, what kind of content will be more well received?
Sure. Thank you. Story-wise, this was definitely more me writing for me as I've matured in my writing and as I have a clearer sense of vision about being able to sit in a seat where I can share work with the world. It's become more for the audiences in conjunction with me that I'm thinking about. Poetry is such a specific craft process that every comma, every verb choice, every line break, every little detail, the way the poem is sitting on the page is thought about many times over. And a lot of that with my work is for the accessibility of the reader, so that it doesn't feel foreign, that it is an open door that they are welcomed into. So there's a lot of specificity about that. Yeah. Thank you.
I was just curious, because you said it's a very cathartic for you when you write it. When you either read it to yourself like 10 years later or tonight, is there pain with you that still holds on, or is it clear? Is there a different?
Yeah. I started writing the bulk of this in 2017, right? We met in 2018, 2017. And that first version of this book was, I like to say, like with a red Sharpie, like that motherfucker, so there was a lot of anger and pain in the early versions of this, which sucked and wouldn't have ever gotten published. And a lot of those poems got cleared away, right? Now it feels like there's so much distance in time, and one of the biggest things that helped is the changing of the names, right? Like, so it's not literally my name or my ex-husband's name. And with putting that layer of character and persona in, that distances some. And it's interesting, the poems about Daisy that I read from here tonight are probably the most painful ones for me in the book. They also feel like that time in that grieving feels like it's been laid to rest. And now I'm in a new chapter of like processing the grief, which has been painful to move through in a different way. But it's good pain because it's resilience and skill building as a human. And, the grief doesn't go away. It just, it changes. We change in relationship to it. Yeah. Thank you.
Anyone else? Yes.
I'm curious, Emily, we've known each other a really long time, and I always knew that you were a writer, but you had so many phases. Like when we first met, you were teaching, and then you had the restaurant years, and then, when you were doing a lot of yoga, and you still do a lot of yoga. I'm just curious, were you writing consistently the whole time, or how did you kind of, carve out kind of this practice for yourself and make it or were you always able to prioritize it in these different phases?
That's another good question. It was, and it makes me think about you and your journey, right? When I met you, you were a lawyer and like just dabbling in acting, and now you're like an actor in your element, right? It was always with me, and I was always writing. I was writing really crappy poems for the bulk of my life because I was overwhelmed in the restaurant world or overwhelmed as a high school teacher in New York City, and there just wasn't the mental space for that kind of practice. So I am very grateful that my life has shifted to allow for that. And then another really important variable is I was wearing for many years the identity of a poet. It felt very cool to sit in a bar at 2 a.m. and drink whiskey and write my poems, like the inspiration from the muse, or smoke a joint and like the world of creativity. And those are some of the worst poems I've ever written, right? And so it's when I stopped drinking and stopped smoking weed and really tapped into deepening my relationship to being present through a more disciplined approach to yoga and living through right action and right speech, that the poems actually started to emerge in a different way. And with that, it's been much easier to cultivate a daily ritual of sitting down and relating to the writing. Yeah, it's like growing up. I feel like for all of us in this room, like we refine and sharpen down the Dharma path, the calling that we start to find as ours. Yeah, thanks. Good. This is the best group of questions.
These are really good. Anybody else? No? There is pizza waiting,
There is
which is
pizza
always
waiting.
a good thing. I just want to say thank you. It's been an
Thank
absolute
you.
pleasure to have the assignment, if you will, of reading this so closely and getting to know you and having you share so much with us, and fascinated to see what that next collection is going to look like.
Thank you.
Congratulations on that.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all for being here. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Again, like I said, we have plenty of books up front to purchase. We have some surprise pizza over there. Not too much. Make sure you get some for me. And yeah, enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. And I'll sign books if anybody wants. Yeah, please eat the pizza.